All right, good morning. As of right now, I'm by myself, which is totally fine. And today is Wednesday, the 16th of November. This is the email that I sent out earlier this morning with the link on it for today's presentation. As it says, today I'm going to go over chapter 21, which is entitled How to Use ADO.net to Write Your Own Data Access Code. And tomorrow we'll go over chapter 22, which is on how to use the grid view control. Friday will be our typical lab day, meaning that no taping will be done. On Monday, I think that rather than starting on our database project on Monday, I'm going to create a small database program. I've even shown it to you already, but it'll allow us to go through some of the terminology in chapters 21 and 22 and see them in action, so to speak. Then on Tuesday of next week, 11/22, we'll begin our database project. And as it says, you will be responsible for coding along with me. In other words, you're going to be creating this as well and submitting it. All right, that'll be the last thing, other than, of course, the electronic portfolio that you'll have to do for the rest of the semester. Wednesday will be a lab day, and I'm doing this for two reasons. First of all, I typically give one lab day a week. And second of all, I know that some people, at least, some people, um, Wednesday is a travel day for them if they're going places for Thanksgiving. So I didn't want to make it where you had to watch a video or do anything. Now, what I am doing is I am giving you an assignment that's due next Wednesday by midnight. And that is to complete the written test for chapter 19, chapter 21, and chapter 22. But, you know, if you are all caught up on everything, you should be able to knock those out, I would think, on Friday, on the lab day. And again, some of you have talked to me individually. If you are behind in the class on homework, all right, I will still accept late work. But if you're turning in something late, all right, it'd be real nice if you sent me an email. So maybe you didn't do the first 10 written tests and now you've done them, something like that. Well, just send me an email once you put it out there in your GitHub repository. Please do that. All right. Hopefully everything on here makes at least a little bit of sense. And I'm going to jump right into chapter 21. As it says there, how to use ADO.net to write your own data access code. In the last chapter, we talked a little bit about entity framework. Now, when I did this last year, when I taught this class last time, what we ended up doing was we ended up going through some of the examples in the book. Some things worked, some things didn't work, and it was a seated class. So when student stuff didn't work, I was able typically to go over there and help them get it to work. The problem that we have doing a lot of this stuff in here now is if something doesn't work, really the only way that I can probably help you is to set up a Teams meeting with you and have you take over the screen so I can see your screen so we can see what's going on. Now, as we start to go through this stuff, if we need to do that, we will. All right. I'm willing to meet with any of you over Microsoft Teams. All right. If we need to do that, we can set up our own individual meeting. All right. Now, with what we did yesterday, even though we looked at a lot of code, the majority of that code was pre-written for us when we set up certain things. All right. Today, we're talking about taking more control ourselves and being able to basically um, have more control over what's happening. And as it says there, it gives us more control than what we had with the entity framework. All right, so it says in those cases, you can create and work with ADO.net objects through code. That's what's in this chapter. Shorter chapter than yesterday. All right, but it's still close to 40 pages. So we'll have a quick introduction to ADO.net. Then we'll go into how to work with connections and commands. Next, we'll go into probably one of the best features about working with ADO.net, and that's how to create and work with parameters. The reason that that is so important is it allows you to basically configure queries as your program is running. So in other words, if you were to go out there and let's say that you wanted, let's assume, for example, that you had some kind of a screen up there with employees, all right? And then maybe you had a drop-down list for the different departments. So while the program was running, you could, use the drop-down and choose a certain department, maybe shipping, and then print out all of the employees who were in the shipping department. Then you could run it later and pick out programming, etc. All right. We'll talk about how to execute commands, what things like data readers are, and then we'll go in for the last 15 or so pages and we'll talk about the customer maintenance application. I will tell you with this customer maintenance application, it is the exact same interface as what we saw yesterday. But rather than kind of pre-building it using the entity framework, you build it and you use ADO.NET or ActiveX data objects. All right. Okay. So with that said, let's get started. So as it says, ADO.NET is the primary data access API. Now we've talked a little bit about this term before, but I want to mention it again. API is application program interface. It's basically a mechanism that allows two things to talk to one another. All right. Normally, it's two pieces of software that can talk to one another. But it's, for lack of better words, it's kind of like a contract that's written up either between you and software or software and software that says, I'll provide these services for you, but in return, you will do them, you will invoke those services the way that you're supposed to. All right. And you see this kind of stuff all the time. I've given examples like this before. Technically, there's an API if you bring up a calculator. So if I bring up the calculator on here, I'm not going to. But if I do, there's an API in there. In other words, if I want to go and add two numbers, I put in the first number, I hit the add button or the plus sign. I put in the second number, I hit the equal sign. All right. And I should get the correct answer all the time. All right, with ADO.NET, as it says here, it provides classes to develop database applications. All right. Primarily, it's used with C#, but as it says there, it can be used with other .NET languages. All right. So they start here by talking about the .NET data providers. And you can kind of look at it this way. There's SQL Server and there's everything else. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, first, maybe what I just said was unfair. If you go into Microsoft Office, what you'll find in there, I mean, most people go in and they say, yeah, I've gone into Office, I've used Word, and I've used Excel, etc. But there's also a database that's inside of Microsoft Office, and that's called Access. And it's actually not a bad little database, but I just put it that way on purpose. It's a little database. It's not designed for you to create a project in there and have hundreds or thousands or more users banging on it. It just doesn't support that many. It basically is a desktop type of database. It works best when you have really 10 or less users. All right. The reason I'm telling you that is sometimes what happens is people go in and they create an application and they use Access in it, and then they discover Access isn't big enough, so they port it over to SQL Server. So SQL Server and Microsoft Access are both Microsoft products. Now, basically, when you work with databases in Visual Studio, they're designed to work with most any type of database. They work best with SQL Server. And actually, when you think about it, at least, that should make sense. Microsoft products should play the best with Microsoft products. And like I said, that just makes sense. But you can use other data providers. And two things they mention in here are OLEDB and ODBC. And OLEDB is object linking and embedding database, and ODBC is open database connectivity. All right. Now it says here the OLEDB data provider is a generic provider that can access any database. Although you can use it even with SQL Server, you shouldn't unless you're going to migrate or take SQL Server and use some other platform with it like Oracle or something else. All right. ODBC, as it says, lets you access any database that can work with ODBC. And as it says, it's another industry standard database interface. Well, when I looked at that, I thought that's all fine and dandy, but I wanted to go out and give you a better description of them. So I went out and looked all over the place, and one of the best ones I found was here on Stack Overflow. What is the difference between OLEDB and ODBC data sources? Now, 14 years ago is when it was first asked, but it was modified 6 months ago, and it's got a lot of views. And if you go down maybe a third of the way or so, they've got a picture in here that may be more confusing than not. But if you go down a little bit further, oh, I'd say about a third of the way down. Okay, so here they say ODBC, again, Open Database Connectivity, is an industry-wide standard interface for accessing table-like data. It was primarily developed for databases and presents data in collections of records, each of which are grouped into a collection of fields. All right, well, that should sound pretty familiar to you. All right, because that's pretty much when I was giving the definition of database, it's pretty much what we've talked about. All right, it says each database vendor supplies an ODBC driver for their database. There are also ODBC drivers for objects that are not database tables, like spreadsheets, CSV files, and columnar reports. That's how I look at ODBC, is that ODBC can be used for databases, but quite often it's meant so that you are able to use non-database sources as database data. All right. Then there's OLEDB, again, object linking and embedding database. All right. And as it says, it's another Microsoft technology for access to data. Now notice, unlike ODBC, it encompasses both table-like and non-table-like data. All right. However, it's procedure-oriented rather than object-oriented and is regarded as rather a difficult interface with which to develop access to data sources. All right. So it says to overcome this, ADO was designed to be an object-oriented layer on top of this to try to make this more programmatic-like. All right. Finally, that last paragraph there says, while all databases have ODBC drivers, they don't all have OLEDB drivers. Now, the kind of funny thing about this is if you look at this enough, even in here, up above here where they have all this, people were disagreeing. Somebody would say something and then somebody else would disagree with it, etc. And I just found the whole thing interesting. Now, what we've been using thus far is we've been using MySQL. All right. What I hope to have us do when we do our project is to have us transition over into SQL Server. So we'll actually use Microsoft's database project, all right, for what we're working on. That's at least my hope. If we have problems doing it, we have to pull back and go back to MySQL, we will. The good news, though, is if we start this on Tuesday of next week, I don't know, Tuesday of next week is somewhere around day, let's see, 65 or something like that. So we basically still have a good 2.5 weeks. I want to give you at least the last class period or two to work on your electronic portfolios. If you've got all your work in by that Wednesday, technically the last day of class is Thursday, and it is Thursday the 15th. So a month from yesterday. That's it. So a month from today, the 16th, you're done. All right, that's my day that I've got to create final grades and do a bunch of other paperwork. All right. And then we start up again, and I think it's the 9th. I could be wrong, but I believe it's the 9th is when we come back. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through any more of this, but again, it's an interesting resource. It's from stackoverflow.com, and it's just entitled, What is the difference between OLEDB and ODBC data sources? All right. Then I thought, okay, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I go out and basically see what Microsoft has out there? So I keyed in here, Microsoft ADO.net. I found a lot of different stuff, as you'd probably guess. And I used to push people over to a thing on Microsoft that for whatever reason, they called it Channel 9. And that's where they had a lot of their free videos and a lot of other stuff. But they've renamed it Microsoft Learn. All right. So if I go out here to ADO.net Microsoft Learn and I click on this, there's some stuff in here. There's actually a lot of stuff in here. But, again, ADO.net is a set of classes that expose data access services for .NET framework programmers. Well, what the heck does that mean? That means, again, that it provides ways for the programmer to be able to go in and create C# code that allows them to manipulate databases. All right. And when you look in here, what's new? Well, if you don't know what's old, you probably don't care. I'm going to go to this one in just a second. I got it right there. The overview, more on Entity Framework, some more on link stuff. But if I keep going down here, you'll notice under this related sections and the see also, then there's recommended content. There's a whole overview on ADO.net, and there's a bunch of other stuff in here as well. All right. So the only other thing I'd mention quickly is this thing. And again, this is from learnmicrosoft.com. It is the ADO.net overview. Notice it's a 2-minute read. So we're going to go through most of it because it's very short. As it says, it provides consistent access to data sources. All right. Not just SQL Server, but data sources exposed through OLEDB and ODBC. So in other words, SQL Server, which is the Microsoft product, and non-Microsoft database products. All right. It says data sharing consumer applications can use ADO.net to connect to these data sources, retrieve, handle, and update the data they contain. That is those CRUD operations that we talked about. Create, which is basically an insert type of operation. Read, which is basically a select type of operation. Update, and delete. So as it says here, ADO.net separates data access from data manipulation into discrete components that you can use separately or in tandem. It includes data providers for connecting to a database, executing database commands, and retrieving results. The results are processed directly or placed in an ADO.net data set, or they can be combined with multiple sources, or they can be passed back and forth. All right. Now they talk, this is a little, where they're created and stuff. That's not that big a thing. But again, if you go through here, you can see everything that's in there, the architecture, etc. I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought in the architecture, there you go, there was a picture in there. Now that's a little bit complex, and there's a similar picture in your book. But you'll notice you've got a data set. All right, you can see what the data set is made of, and there's a data table collection. And as we work our way down, there's a data view collection. All right, and data tables are made up of data rows, and data rows are made up of data columns, etc. So it's a lot of the stuff that we have been talking about. All right, so let me put this away, and let's jump right into the chapter then. All right. So they talk some more in here about OLEDB and ODBC, but I think I've given you more than they even give you here. When you use these different things, so when you use non-SQL Server stuff, all right, the names are going to be different. So for instance, if we want to use SQL Server, which is what I'm hoping we're going to be able to do, we're going to have to say using Microsoft.data.sql client. If we were to use OLDB, OLEDB, it would be using system.data.OLEDB. And if we were to use ODBC, it would be using system.data.ODBC. All right. The data providers themselves, you'll notice that the SQL Server ones all start with SQL. The OLEDB ones all start with OLEDB. And the ODBC all start with ODBC. All right. So these data providers, as it says, they provide classes that are responsible for allowing you, the programmer, to work directly with the database. I'm hoping, again, that we're going to be able to go in and put myself in a corner here, because I'm saying this is what we're going to try to do, is use SQL Server. And if we cannot, if we have problems with this, again, I'm going to have to back up and use probably an OLEDB. All right. So there's a lot of stuff in this chapter. Again, we're going to go through it fairly quickly. We're not going to go through much of the code that's in here at all. We didn't yesterday. We're not going to today. I decided to pull back and show you, and I think I've shown you this already, but this is the application that we'll work on Monday of next week. It's going to be called a SQL Server tester. All right. So we can run this program. And when we run it, this is a data grid view control. And when it runs, it's going to look a lot like a spreadsheet. But if I come in here and say, select star from products, for example, all right, that's the query. And if I say to execute the query, it comes back and it says we've got 16 products. Here they are. All right, I can make this wider, because it's not showing very well in here right now. So there you go. So you can see everything. All right. There probably is a way to make this code in here bigger. I didn't even look at that, but there probably is. All right. But these are the different products that we have. Now, with this stuff, this is grabbing the products. This is grabbing the stuff from Murach. All right. So these are the products from Murach's database. We're going to see if we can bring in a different database, and we'll see if it works and how it works. All right. What we will do, because believe it or not, this is a really, really simple interface. What do I mean? Well, again, if I come in here and look under, let me go back to viewing the toolbox here. All right. If I click on this, what is this? It's a data grid view. How do I get that? Well, again, I come in here under the data controls, and there's a data grid view. I just drop it in. Boom. We'll do that on Monday. This is just a text box. It's a multi-line text box where we can put in big queries. There's a button that says execute query. There's a button that says clear. There's a button that says exit. Now here are actually two different labels. There's one label that says rows returned, and here's the other label, and that label is going to put in how many records were actually returned when we ran the query. So again, you notice that if we run this, and I come in and I say select star from products, all right, and I hit enter, it came back with 16 things. On the other hand, I don't know if there's one called states or not. Yeah, there's 53, because it's got all 50 states plus the District of Columbia and probably the Virgin Islands and one other thing that's in here. I don't know what the other, Puerto Rico. All right, so that's the 53. But the point is this, all right, that what I'm going to give you on Monday, I'm just going to very quickly show you. We're going to write all this code together. It's not a lot of code. 170 lines, that's not really much code. But not only that, I've got all sorts of comments that I put in here. All right. And what I am going to do is I'm going to give you, at least at the beginning, I'm going to give you this stuff that's in here right there. So I'm going to give you those comments. Why? Because it's got some URLs in there that we're going to be able to go through and try to explain everything that's happening in here. Again, in an ideal world, this is going to kind of meld together what we're learning today in chapter 22 and what we will learn tomorrow in chapter 23. That's the goal. That's my goal, at least. All right. So as we go through here, okay, it says, shows how you work with data in a database using ADO.net. In order to do that, you execute a command object. What's those commands? Again, it's telling you that you want to either view data in a database or do an insert or do an update or do a delete. Now, if you want to view data in a database, you'll use a select. When you use a select, all right, you typically will use what's called a data reader object. Now, you can look at this, you can read the last few sentences, etc. But the thing is, a data reader object is kind of referred to as being like a fire hose. All right. In other words, if firemen and firewomen, whatever, if fire people come to a fire, what do? They hook up their hose to a hydrant and they start to spray water, right? And they're spraying in a forward direction. Well, in the same way, when you use a data reader object, it's a read-only object that allows you to look at all of the data in a database, but you cannot modify it. Not only that, it only lets you read in a forward direction. So if I've got 10 records and I've read the first 6, I can't back up and look at record 1 again. It only goes forward. And that's what they're talking about in here. So they show an example. Now, this is a pictorial example in here, but what are they showing? What they're showing in here is you need a connection object. All right. That connection object that's in there, you'll use the connection to allow you to basically access data in a database server, and you'll use it whether you are using an insert, update, delete, or whether you're using a select. But with the select only, you'll end up using the data reader. So when you run a select command, the results of that command are what are referred to as a data set. When you use a data reader, you are looking at those automatically, it's read only. So they show some, basically they show some text in here, but it's pretty much what I just mentioned to you. All right. I'd like to use my own words rather than sit and read to you. All right. So how to work with connections and commands. All right. So there are a few things to be leery of in here. All right. Typically, when you work with these things, you'll work with what's called a connection string. We looked at this a little bit yesterday. We're going to look at it some more today. All right. So it says before you use a command to access a database, you need to open up a connection to that database. All right. Also, when you're done working with that connection, you should close it. If you don't close it, it gets closed automatically when the program closes. However, if you've got multiple people sharing the same database, leaving a connection open can make it very hard, if not impossible, for other people to look at a database you may have left open. And that all goes back to that idea that we mentioned yesterday when we talked about concurrency. All right. They also mentioned down here, it says the figure on the next page will show some of the common values you'll need to specify when you're working with an SQL Server database. It says the first 2 connection strings are SQL Server Express local DB and SQL Server Express databases. It says the connection string is local DB. Well, the key thing there is it's saying you are using your machine to host the database. It's local. So you would have to change that connection string if you ever wanted it to go out where the whole world could see it. But local is good when you're starting and when you're testing. All right. As it says, the requirements for each different provider vary. So you're always best off looking for internal documentation for the particular provider that you're using. All right, so they show an example of using access in here. I've already talked to you about what access is. All right. Then it says the code at the bottom starts by using the configuration manager object to retrieve a connection string from the app.config file. Now, good, bad, or indifferent, there are different ways to connect to a database. You don't necessarily have to use this app.config. All right, and what do I mean? Well, if you look at the example that I'm using right now in here, and I go to app.config, there's nothing in there that's configuring a database. All right. The advantage of going in and using app.config is you can tell it exactly what database you're working with. You can set up things like passwords in there, and there's other different options rather that you can use with app.config that may make it advantageous to use that. So again, common properties, a connection string. That's what I tried showing you in there. Provides information for accessing an SQL Server database. I already talked about opening the connection and closing the connection. All right. And there's some other things that are in here as well. Now they show you a couple of connection strings, one for an SQL Server Express local DB and one for a different one. In other words, notice that this is local DB, etc., and this is localhost. All right, here's one for, again, for access. And there's other ways that you can set these as well. And it says here, you can store the configure or the connection string as described in the previous chapter. We didn't really look at that much. Not going to lie to you. All right. Again, it says here, the connection object should be closed when you're done with it. All right. Okay, how to create and work with commands. We're going to look at these right now. Some of the commands that are in here. All right. It's probably easiest just to show you the stuff that's in here. So again, remember, these are ones that start with SQL. All right, so it is expecting we're using SQL Server right there. So these properties, again, I don't want to read to you. We already looked at connection. All right, for command text, you can go and you can write what's called a stored procedure, which is basically you're doing the equivalent of writing a function that you want to run against the database, for lack of better words. That's pretty much what you're doing there. There's a command type that determines how this text is going to be interpreted. There are parameters, and I already mentioned with those parameters, all right, that with those parameters, that allows you to create dynamic queries. So you could basically change the information that's being requested in the query as the program's running. Then we've got three methods here: execute reader, execute non-query, and execute scalar. The first one is execute reader. All right. And what that does is basically that is the results that you're going to get when you do a select command. All right, we'll look at one of those at the bottom of the screen in just a second. That's an execute reader. All right, then there's an execute non-query, which is a weird name, but it's anything that's not a select statement. So it is an insert, an update, or a delete. It's called a non-query because rather than returning information and returning records, it returns an integer that indicates the number of rows that were affected. All right. And I've given you examples like this before, but if I go in basically and I do something for which there really are no matches, 0 is an acceptable value. Finally, there's execute scalar. And with execute scalar, what it says there basically is you only want to return the first column of the first row of the result set. All right, I don't know if we're going to do much, if any, work with that. All right. And let's take a look at the example that's down here. So we create a string here that looks really, really similar to what we did when we were working, for example, in PHPMyAdmin. So string select equals select customer ID, comma, name, comma, address, comma, city, comma, state, comma, zip code, all right, from customers, all right? And if that's everything, I don't know if the star works, the asterisk, I think you do have to list out every single field you're looking for. Then we're telling it to create a connection. Then we're basically telling it to run the command. All right. And then we will tell it to close it when we're done. Now, I already mentioned this to you, so I'm saying it again. It says a parameter is a variable that's used in an SQL statement. Two things about this. First, again, as I already mentioned to you, yes, it is a variable. So it allows you to basically, when you are writing queries, it allows you to work in such a way that you can change the information you're looking for as the program is running. So that's the first thing. Okay. Like I said, it's a variable. The second thing is it's going to look different as far as how you refer to this variable, whether you're using SQL or OLEDB or ODBC. They all work the same, but the syntax you use for them will look different. So as it says here, parameters let you create statements that retrieve or update database data based on variable information. All right, to give an example, it says an application that maintains the customer table can use the where clause to select a specific row or rows that they want. So a select statement that uses parameters in a where clause is a parameterized query. All right, and notice you can use it with a select for a parameterized query. You can also use parameters in insert, update, and delete. So to use these, you use placeholders. And what I'm saying though is the type of the type of symbol that you use for a placeholder differs based on whether or not you are using SQL Server, OLEDB, or ODBC. All right. And what is it? So it says that with SQL Server, you use a named variable to identify a parameter. The name of the variable must begin with an @ sign and is usually given the same name as the column. So if you had first name, the thing would be @ first name, basically. On the other hand, when you use OLEDB or ODBC, you use a question mark. So they're going to show you examples of both. All right. So if we take a look here, notice here it says select all this stuff, all right, from here, and then it says where customer ID equal question mark. Again, that's the variable thing. And here it's the same query, but it says where customer ID equals @ customer ID. So this right here, this @ customer ID is doing the same thing as that question mark is doing here. All right. Sometimes you need even more variety than that. So this, notice what we have here. We say insert into this values @ name, @ address, @ city, @ state, @ zip code. Well, what we could be doing right there potentially is grabbing, is we could set up a form. We could set up a form. All right. And on that form, we could have 5 text boxes. One that represented a person's name, one for their address, one for their city, one for their state, one for their zip code. And then, once they filled in stuff, we could put a button in there that said execute, and it would add that record to the database. All right, so that's an insert. Here's a delete, but you'll notice again, since they're the SQL Server ones, we're using the @ sign with all this. All right, I think I've read enough that or talked about this enough. You can read this if you have a desire, but I think I've hit most of the high points in here. All right. So it says after you define an SQL statement that contains parameters, you create parameter objects. So you're shown how to do this in here. All right. You can see this is getting pretty heavy. That's why, again, when you take the AWD1115 class, which is typically the fourth class in the AWD curriculum, it might be the third. So you may take it this summer, you may take it next fall. I don't know because I don't plan your schedules. All right. But this is the kind of stuff that you'll be working on in a lot more depth and breadth of coverage. So if it makes little to no sense right now, that's actually okay. The idea is I'm just giving you an initial exposure to it. All right. Common members of the parameters collection. So what do you want to do with it? All right. Notice there are 4 different add parameters. Adding them to a collection, creating a parameter with a specified type and adding it to a collection, creating a parameter with a specified name and type and size and adding it to the collection, and a name and giving it a predefined value and adding it to a collection. And again, they give you some examples right here. But the idea is what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to use C# like code and things like I said, like a form or whatever, and you want to be able to manipulate a database behind the scenes, so to speak. And that's everything that's being talked about in here. All right. All right. So how to execute commands. It says the method you use to execute the SQL statement depends on the operation you're performing. Again, you can use execute reader for the select, execute scalar to retrieve one thing from a select, and execute non-query for the other 3 operations, those being insert, update, and delete. And they will show you some examples in here of using these things. All right. We're going to go over some of this stuff next week. I tried to, again, I'm trying to be real transparent here with you and let you know that last year we went through a bunch of the examples that were in the book, and we got the majority of them to work. And I'd say, okay, any questions, etc. People would say no, usually at least. But there were a few people in the class that I felt I could talk to either before class or after class and say, is this stuff making sense? And what did you get out of this? And I talked to one gentleman in particular because he had been tutoring students, and he stayed after class one day and we were talking. And I said, does this stuff make sense? He goes, yeah, it kind of does to me. I said, what do you think to the rest of the class? And he said, I don't really think they care. Because if you're not going to be exactly be giving them a test on it or make them do a program on it themselves, they probably don't even care. And he wasn't saying it to be mean or anything. So what I decided to do was, rather than go over the examples that are in the book, that we would create something from scratch ourselves. And that's what we'll be doing next week. So again, how to execute queries that return a single value. They go through some code in here. And I already mentioned this stuff that's in here about the execute non-query, etc. All right. So the last thing that's discussed in here, and it's about the last 15 to 20 pages, is this same customer maintenance application that we looked at in the previous chapter. But in the previous chapter, we had the majority of the code written for us using the entity framework. In here, in this chapter, we're going to look at the ADO.NET commands for performing the different CRUD operations. So again, this should look familiar to you. It's the exact same interface that we looked at yesterday. So again, nothing really new in there, okay? Same even kind of dialogue. Before you delete something, you ask. So I'm not going to read this. I'm going to leave it up there for a second though, because it pretty much works the same way that everything worked yesterday. All right. So this is interesting because they have what's called a class diagram in here. We're going to take a look at it in just a second. It says the diagram shows the business and database classes that are used in the application. It says, although you can create a class diagram like this using Visual Studio, they became an optional feature back in Visual Studio 2017. So there is a class design component that you can install if you want one of these. It's not important that you do this and you design one of these things, but I wanted to go over it with you because I wanted to at least hopefully make some sense as far as what we're doing here. So that's what I want to discuss for the next few minutes. All right. So it says the customer and state classes define the business objects that are used in this application. Each class contains auto-implemented properties that can be used to store values for the columns in the table. Well, that should sort of make sense, especially with state, that it would be pre-populated. The customer and state database classes also provide static methods for working with the tables that are in this MMA books database. All right. So when we look in here, this is what it looks like. Now, there are different types of diagrams that you can create when you are working with this stuff. There are different types of diagrams. For instance, you can create a UML or a unified modeling language diagram. You've already seen those when we went in and we were talking about the stuff in classes. If you remember, it would take a class and it would separate it into thirds, basically. That was the name of the class. Then we had the properties, and then we had the methods. Well, in here, all right, notice there's a customer and there's just properties. There's a customer DB, and that's just methods. So we're kind of separating the stuff out, for lack of better words. So it says here, this project contains the classes that define the business objects that are used. All right, what do we want to be able to do? What do we want to be able to manipulate in here? You'll notice, as it says, any class that ends with DB, which is short for database. In other words, customer DB, state DB, and MMA books DB are database classes. As it says here, they provide the methods and a read-only property for working with a database. So this, notice DB methods, DB methods, DB, well, there's fields, but that's the connection string. On the other hand, customer properties, state properties. So it's kind of, again, kind of split up. Now, we're going to jump through this very quickly. We're probably going to be done in about 5 minutes. All right. And I don't think it's going to pay because I can't do this due diligence. I really can't. All right. It says it begins by showing the code for the books class. Well, let's just take a look at each one of these. All right. So when we look right here, boy, there's sure not much. But if you remember, this was just meant to set up the connection string. That's all. All right. Here's the customer one. Now that looks somewhat similar to things we've done before. But when you look at it, you'll notice right away here, at the beginning, well, there's a select statement. All right. So what are we doing in there? All right, we're selecting virtually everything from the customer's table, but we're using one of these parameterized queries in here. So what we want is we want to be able to select a unique customer. So what this is doing in here, if I jump backwards in here, is that is grabbing whatever value we're putting in there. All right, that is the parameterized query value. So when we click get customer, it goes to the database and it fills up or fills out the appropriate text boxes. All right. Also, what we're able to do in here, when you look, here we are creating a new customer. So again, what we're ending up doing in this case, all right, is this is pretty much the code between here and here, but this code is the code that would execute when we press the add customer button. They don't show that pictorially in here. They just show the modify. All right. But if it was add, this should be all empty in here. We can put in any name we want, any address we want, any city we want. We can choose any state we want and add any zip code we want. Once we've done all that, then we go through here and we actually call the add customer. All right. When we're all done. And what is that doing? Again, it's creating a string, and the values for that string are the parameterized query values that we would end up getting from that form. All right, and we are filling up or adding that record to the database. Hopefully, at least that made a little bit of sense. And you can always read the stuff that's in here. All right. Now, I don't know. I have not done the written test for chapters 21 and 22. This may take some time and effort on your part to do that, to go through those written tests. Give them your best shot, please. All right, so here's the customer class. So again, notice what we're doing here. All right. So basically we are setting up the parameterized values based off of this stuff that we've created. And this select indent current customers from customer. All right. This is an execute non-query to allow us to basically come in and grab a customer. This is going to allow us to come in and update a customer. All right. There's a lot of stuff in here, and it's doggone important. What I mean is when you look here, because we've got the modify right here. All right. And I may have talked about this yesterday, but it bears repeating. And that is that the name, if I come in here and I say that none of these can be empty, as an example. So then if you leave anything empty and you click accept, it should come up with an error. All right. Well, maybe you've got a customer and you have a name, but you don't know an address, a city, etc. You don't know that stuff yet. So maybe the only one that you make mandatory is the name. I don't know. You might make all of them mandatory. All right. Also, here you might have the first option in this dropdown might be select a state. All right. You could default it to a state. There's all sorts of ways that this could be conceivably done. And here is the code for deleting a customer. All right. The big thing there is you want to make sure that when you run that, you are deleting the correct customer. So typically, you will do something where that if you click the delete button, you'll ask and you'll say, hey, is this the one that you really meant to delete? Now, here is the code for the state DB class. There's a get state. Okay. Get states and get state. Well, the key thing in here is probably in a states table after you set it up. Okay, you're never going to modify it. Now, if it turned out that, as an example, let's say that I think that might be Guam or something like that is a United States province, and it may not be in our list. Okay. So in other words, when I come in here and I run this like I showed you before, right, and I say select star from states, and I click execute, it gives us 53. Well, goes right from Georgia to Hawaii, so Guam isn't in there. Do we want to allow that where we can enter it and insert a brand new state? I don't know. But my guess is probably not. So probably all of the code that you're going to have in here All right. Probably all the codes you're going to have in here for the state table will be, as it's shown right now, just select statements. All right. So this is selecting a certain state. This might be selecting a group of states or vice versa. Let's see. This is get states. All right. So the code and the name. This, it looks like, is just trying to get an individual state. All right. And then they've got the code in there for the customer maintenance form. Again, this is going to be very similar to the stuff we looked at yesterday. All right. And we're just about finished, I believe, with the chapter. All right. So as it says in this chapter, we learned yet another technique for developing database applications. Rather than EF or the entity framework, we talked about how to use ADO.NET and write code ourselves. What we will be getting to then, what we will be getting to next is this data grid view control. This chapter, we're probably going to go over in a little bit more depth and breadth of coverage than what we did in the past. I don't know. I mean, I've read it. I've read this chapter quite a few times. All right. But as it says, applications that work with databases frequently use a data grid view control because it allows you to display multiple records at the same time. Plus, and this again, this is the kind of thing that we're going to be doing in our own application, is we're going to be building a master detail form. I think I mentioned this to you yesterday, but up here, we'll have a list of 15 or so albums. And if you click on a certain album, it should give you all of the information about the songs that are on that album down here. So the example that I hope to work through next week, on Monday, we will transition into using more than one table. When we go through what we'll be building for our actual database project, we're only going to have two tables. But as we go through, we'll talk about how you could add more and why you might want to add more than what's shown in there. All right. So we're going to jump or go through this one next week. So please, for tomorrow, go back and read chapter 22 here. This is the last chapter of the book. All right. Because again, you have to do the written test for 19, 21, and 22. I'm sorry, 19, 21, and 22, not for 20. All right. So this is what we're going to go through. This is what we're going to go through tomorrow. All right. And then last thing, as I'm perusing my way back to the front here. Here. There we go. So tomorrow, again, we are going to go through this chapter. Then on Monday, we are going to build this application that's right here, this one. All right. What I will do on Monday is I'm just going to start with a blank project, but I am going to come in here. So I'm going to create a new project. There won't be any interface in it at all, but I will come in, and again, I'm going to give you this stuff, and I'm going to give you all of this. So as we go through the stuff that's in here, the first 50 or 60 lines of the program, we'll be able to explain what's happening along the way. That's the plan, at least. All right. Then we'll write the rest of it. This is not very difficult stuff. Here's the execute query button. When you call it, we call attempt to execute query, which is going to run the code that's in here. You'll notice it's a pretty long routine. What, 62? It's like 50 lines long. All right. Then the clear, which will clear the GUI, and there's a little bit different stuff in here. And we're going to go through everything that's in here. The exit, maybe not. But we'll also go through what you're doing here when we're loading. So you'll notice we're setting up a connection string here. All right. And I don't know if we're going to use MMA books or if we're going to end up using a different database. We'll go through all of that stuff on Monday. And then on Tuesday next week, we're going to start our actual database project. All right. So again, last thing, because you've already heard it, but just so you know, your next assignment will be to complete the written test for 19, 21, and 22. It will be due by midnight, 1 week from today on the 23rd. All right. That's everything I can think of. So I will see you back here tomorrow at 8:05. Thanks for watching.